Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to tonight's episode of Confabulating. It is our great pleasure to be joined tonight by Professor Paul Freedman of Yale University, who will be speaking with us on the subject of food and social class in the Middle Ages. Professor Freedman is the Chester D. Tripp Professor of History at Yale University, as well as a Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America and a member of the American Philosophical Society and American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and corresponding fellow of the Real Academia de Buenas Letras de Barcelona and the Institut d'Estudis Catalans. During his time at Yale, he has also served as Director of Undergraduate Studies in History, Director of Medieval Studies Program, Chair of the History Department, and Chair of the Program in the History of Science and Medicine. He was awarded his Ph.D. at California, Berkeley in 1978, writing his thesis on Catalonia and interactions between primates and lay society in the Diocese of Vic, and his previous teaching posts have included the Vanderbilt University, the Max Planck Institut für Geschichte in Göttingen, the École des Études en Sciences Sociales. He has written 3 major publications in the last 5 years, all on food and its history. Wide Food Matters, published in 2021, American Cuisine and How It Got That Way in 2020, and 10 Restaurants That Changed America in 2016. And prior to that, he has published on a wide variety of topics, including the Diocese of Vic, the origins of peasant servitude in medieval Catalonia, images of a medieval peasant, and spices and the medieval imagination, in addition to a number of edited and co-edited volumes, including Death and Apocalypse in the Middle Ages, Forms of Servitude in Northern and Central Europe, and 2 books on the history of food, published in 2007 and 2014. His awards include a 2008 Cookbook Award from the International Association of Culinary Professionals, the Haskins Medal of the Medieval Academy, the Otto Grundler Prize, the Eugene Caden Award in Humanities, the American Historical Association's Premier del Rey Prize, the Medieval Academy's Von Cortlandt Elliott Prize, and the Nordhaus Teaching Prize. And his main research interests include medieval social history, the history of Catalonia, comparative studies of peasants, trade in luxury products, and the history of cuisine. Professor Freedman, we're honored to have you come and speak to us this evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks so much, everybody. And I'm honored to have been asked to be with you this evening. As Peter's kind introduction has made it clear, I have sort of 2 interests. I am primarily a medieval historian, but in the last more recent period have become interested in the history of food, not just for the Middle Ages, but for the United States as well. And what links those 2 is my concern with social class and its symbols. So there are all sorts of ways of showing status, or for well-off people to ridicule the customs of the poor, or at least of those they regard as socially inferior to them. Food is just one of them, but it's an interesting one because in some ways it's not as obvious as, for example, clothes, which clearly show fashion, status, and income. But the Middle Ages, but also the contemporary United States, and indeed much of the world, differentiate class on the basis of what you eat. Now, I mean, the most obvious difference in the Middle Ages and today between rich and poor with regard to food is that the rich have enough food, often much more than enough food, and can pick and choose among a variety of options as to what is going to be prestigious. In the Middle Ages, game, spices, ocean fish, large birds like peacocks, or very small birds like ortolans, all of these carried a lot of prestige. There are some foods that either because the species is depleted or fashions change, lose prestige over time. So if you look at novels and menus of 19th century America, the 2 most prestigious dishes appear to be wild canvasback ducks and terrapin, which is a kind of turtle made into a stew or a kind of thick soup-like preparation. And this is just, you had to have these dishes if you were going to have an elegant dinner party. Well, I actually managed to have terrapin once a few years ago at a very old, I think fossilized is a fair term, club in Delaware, which is one of the places that these turtles can be found. But I mean, that took a lot of work. So in the Middle Ages, time moves more slowly, but there are changes in what are prestigious dishes. For example, salad suddenly becomes an item in the 15th century in Italy first. Melons also, which doctors had warned would kill you. Dairy products were dismissed as for peasants, but suddenly in the late Middle Ages, certain kinds of cheese are given prestige. So that is my interest, but of course that doesn't mean I'm not interested in the actual food and what is eaten. So my other accomplishment of recent years gastronomically is that I had lamprey. Lamprey is a huge and rather horrible eel-like creature. It's not actually an eel, but it looks like one. And it sucks out the guts of fish that it preys on. Very unpleasant. And it's very unpleasant to capture and kill as well. But nevertheless, in the Middle Ages, it's a great delicacy. A great delicacy, among other reasons, because it is permitted in Lent and other fasting times. But in fact, it tastes like meat. And I hadn't really believed this, but I had it in Bordeaux, which is one of the places where it is still popular, Lamprey à la Bordelaise. So roasted and served in a red wine sauce. And I've got to say, not only did it taste like meat, it was delicious. And it tasted like short ribs of beef or maybe venison. Yeah, that's sort of the set of interests that brought me to these topics.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. That's definitely an interesting, definitely sort of very interesting to hear about. So keep an eye out for lamprey next time I'm in the south of France.
Yes, well, you should know you're from Britain.
Yes, that's right.
So it used to be a specialty of the area. They used to get them from the Severn in Wales and the west of England. And they still, it's supposed to be served at the Queen's or King's coronation. And in fact, it was served at the Queen's most recent Jubilee. But there was a mini scandal because the lamprey were actually imported frozen from the Great Lakes in the United States.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, crikey, that won't do us all. There we are. Wonderful.
Yeah, well,
wonderful.
You could fish your own maybe, or net your own, however they get them.
Possibly.
Professor,
Wonderful.
I have a question. So having or the classes being something that you were concerned as well when you studied, and obviously in the Middle Ages, and the majority of our sources are probably reflecting how high classes used to eat. As historians, and it's my opinion that we should judge periods on the basis of the most privileged classes only, for example. But so do we have enough sources at the moment to understand how the lower classes ate?
We do. We have had a lot of shift in opinion among historians about the diet of peasants in particular, and of ordinary people in the Middle Ages in general. Christopher Dyer, who taught, retired recently from the University of Leicester, has a wonderful article called "Did the Peasants Really Starve in the Middle Ages?" And his answer is no. And that doesn't mean that they never starved. That doesn't mean that there weren't famines, but the prevailing standard of living had less monotony and a better diet than people had thought until recently. How do we know? Some of it is archaeology, the seeds, bones, and isotopic matter found on sites. Some of it is what's served at almshouses or leprosaria or hospitals or other refuges of the poor. Dyer, in that article, used agreements made between usually parents and children, parents who were too old to work or who wanted to set up, in effect, their retirement. And they would give their property to a son or to a group of children, and then specified how they were to be maintained. That is an enforceable contract that says, I'll get meat 3 times a week, or my dinners will consist of 3 courses, just to make sure that your kids didn't, once having gotten the property, mistreat you. And the expectations there are, and these are not necessarily the wealthiest people in the village. The expectations there are for a diet that is not. Now, having said that, the diet of rich people differs from that of ordinary people historically by variety and to some extent by freshness. So the aristocracy would not eat things like dried fish if they could avoid it, dried and reconstituted salt cod, for example. Charcuterie, even things like bacon or hams. This is one reason why they're not fond of cheese. They tend to have everything fresh except for game, which has been killed fresh, but then left to age.
Can we say in any way that the food in Middle Ages influence any way how we eat nowadays?
Oh, certainly. Of course, it depends what you mean by we. European food changed most dramatically in the 17th and 18th century, spurred on by French shifts in taste. So that, for example, there's much less spice in European food today than there was formerly. Chaucer describes spices like galanga as normal, when in fact, you can only find them in maybe authentic Thai restaurants in European or American cities. So my cat wants to comment on this. But the orientation around meat, the order of courses, the fondness for certain kinds of sweet dishes. These are pretty continuous with the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages high-end, or at least middle-class food is alien, but foundational, if that makes sense.
It's interesting stuff. And continuing on that subject of courses and sort of dining, I suppose one thing that would really interest me to know about is, I suppose, at sort of one of these, I suppose, sort of iconic banquets or more formal meals that perhaps viewers of more sort of would understand more closely with Middle Ages cooking. How exactly would the evening play out? Sort of what sort of, would there be sort of courses? Would there be a sort of specific order of dining and etiquettes? Yeah, sort of how exactly would one of these sort of big major meals play out, out of curiosity?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that, because I think there are 2 things I would emphasize. One is some movies give the impression that medieval or even Game of Thrones style dining is crude and maybe tasty, but not very elegantly presented. And that's completely wrong. If you could afford it, there are all sorts of etiquette books about hand washing, about behavior at the table. There are elaborate instructions about how to carve various things. For example, there's an English book called The Book of Carving that is on every conceivable cut of meat and how to present it. The other thing is that the meal would last a long time, depending again on how ostentatious it was, but it would not consist of a whole lot of courses. Big innovation in the 19th century is the development of what was called Russian service, which is basically what we have now. So if you have like soup, hors d'oeuvre, fish, meat, salad, dessert, something like that at an elegant meal, that is Russian service. You have sort of one course after another. In most of European history up to the 19th century had what later would be called French service, and the Middle Ages too. That means that there are very few changes of taking the plates away from the table. You come to the table and it's got all sorts of different dishes right there. And hold on, I've got to accommodate my cat. I'm sorry. If he gets too pesky, at the entertainment value depreciates, I'll exile him. So the idea behind French service is splendor. You have all sorts of different dishes on the table, and you have one or two changes of service only. Whereas an elegant meal in the late 19th century might have 10 courses or 12 courses.
We have a question from someone who is watching us, which is Rosario Bastos. She asked, what is the true role of spices in seasoning and on the diet, so in the Middle Ages?
Yeah, so it is false, the widely held belief that spices are in medieval food because somehow the meat was not fresh, or the meat was fresh. That's not the problem. They have animals roaming around, even in cities. Butchers are constantly being cited for letting blood flow into the streets, because the butchers are not just selling meat from animals that had been slaughtered elsewhere. They're basically slaughtering in their backyard. So they're eating fresher meat than what most of us who don't live on farms get. But the spices were popular partly for reasons of prestige, partly in imitation of the world of Islam, which, although the religious enemy, was the consumer ideal. People tend to admire the food, the clothing, the decor of those who are richer than they are, even if they hate them for other reasons. American culture has a global reach, even in countries where, let's say, Americans aren't really very popular. So the other thing about spices is they're exotic, they come from far away, they were credited with medicinal purposes, both as treatments for illness, but even more as promoters of what we would now call wellness. They're good for people who don't actually have anything wrong with them, but are somehow afraid that some toxification or something is going to make them, potentially make them ill. So all of that notwithstanding, there is a change in taste. Medieval people liked the spectrum of tastes that you get with spices. They used not only one or two, but as is the case in the Middle East, North Africa, and India, a whole bunch of spice mixtures. And they're in, 70, 80% of the recipes that we have from the Middle Ages. Oh, and they're not just for dessert. I mean, what happens in Europe after the French shift is that spices like cinnamon or cloves cease to be acceptable for main courses and are kind of exiled to desserts where they're perfectly okay. So these are spices in modern times associated with sugar. In the Middle Ages, as is the case in, for example, Morocco, they're not only perfectly acceptable without the sugar, but they're de rigueur, they're required.
Absolutely. I think the restoration of cloves and cinnamon into mainstream dining is definitely something which I would wholeheartedly support.
Well, it's happening. All of what I'm saying about European food is really as of maybe 20 years ago, before Tex-Mex was available all over Stockholm.
Absolutely. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a bit more about the idea of kind of medicine and wellness. So I can imagine, just from what you've told us about the role of spices, there was perhaps an idea of a link between sort of certain foods and health and sort of healthy properties. So I'd like to ask, what sort of foods were seen to be kind of what kind of foods promoted health and well-being in the Middle Ages, and how did that perhaps differ from the modern understanding of health and food?
In some ways, it doesn't differ that much. And the concern with wellness manifested by fussing over toxicity or particularly balance and equilibrium is very much an evocation of not just Ayurvedic South Asian medicine or Chinese medicine, but of the traditions of Greek medicine as interpreted by Arab physicians and doctors in the medieval Latin West. So certain foods were not good for anyone, like melons, for example, like raw fruit in general was thought to be indigestible and to send poisonous gases up from the stomach. But other foods were good or bad depending on your individual humoral profile. The humors are these four bodily fluids, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, that have correspondence with the four elements and with heat, moisture, dryness, and cold. And nobody is a perfectly balanced person when it comes to humors. So the doctor is supposed to prescribe you, recommend for you a diet that will offset your humoral bias. So if you're excessively sanguine in the temperament of blood, you should have certain foods. But if you're melancholic, you should have hotter foods. Some foods that are dangerous could be offset with spices. So for example, lamprey, spices tend to be hot and dry. Lamprey is dangerously cold and wet. So doctors recommended that it be served. I mean, first of all, they recommended that you not eat it. But if you must eat it, serve it with black pepper sauce, because pepper is hot and dry in the 4th degree.
Can we say that the physician worked very closely with the chef as well, with the cook?
Officially, yes. I think it's just like now. People consume huge numbers of diet books, consult their doctors about their diets. Chefs make all sorts of claims about their food, cookbook writers. But that doesn't mean that they're obeying the instructions they receive, because most people don't really like to eat the food that they are told is good for them. What they want is, they want healthful food that they like. And it's not that it's impossible, but that I mean, it's no accident that the United States is the country that has among the worst obesity problems, and certainly consumes more diet books per capita than any other part of the world. So doctors consulted with chefs, and powerful people often kept a doctor to advise them about what they were eating. But that doesn't mean that they actually followed that advice. In Don Quixote, there's this, when Sancho Panza gets his island, he's dismayed to find out that the doctor, now that he's a ruler, won't let him eat anything, at least anything that he likes.
Which is unpleasant. So we spoke already at least about two misconceptions that people have. Obviously, some of them thanks to a series that I love, like Game of Thrones. But if we speak about misconceptions, which ones would you, Professor, say are the most common ones in terms of food in Middle Ages?
Well, the spices one is very common. The Game of Thrones is good at showing elegance in terms, and actually the book is fascinating. It's not obvious from the film, but Tyrion loves lamprey and brings a chef with him to King's Landing in his first return there. Another misconception is that peasants starved, or that common people, ate food that was damaged or blighted or rotten. That Marco Polo brought pasta to Europe from China is a venerable but untrue belief. They had pasta before Marco Polo, and people exaggerate the degree to which random travelers or merchants bring things. Usually they're people who intend to bring things. Marco Polo didn't set out as a gastronomic tourist or entrepreneur on that scale. So there are lots of them.
Thank you, and it's good to know that you watch Game of Thrones as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, I loved reading the books. I've got to say that the visualization of some of it was a little strong for me. But yeah, certainly. No, I think he did a great job with food, and I have written on Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, and food. And one of the differences between Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones is that there's almost no food in Lord of the Rings. We're told that hobbits love food, but we're told very little about what they actually eat. And once you get out of the Shire, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of food at all. We have no idea beyond the waybread what they're eating in Lothlorien, what was served at the Aragorn's wedding in Gondor, and certainly you can't imagine Sauron on the one hand, or Gandalf either, tucking into a hearty meal. It's just like there's much less sex in Tolkien, to put it mildly, than in Game of Thrones.
I have two questions from people who is watching us. One is from Simon Davies, and he's saying, talking of lampreys, did King John of England really die of a surfeit of these animals?
No, it's King Henry I who actually did die fairly suddenly. And contemporaries said that his doctor had warned him against eating lampreys. And he went ahead, just as I said before, your doctors can give you advice, but that doesn't mean you're going to follow it. But it wasn't a surfeit. In other words, it wasn't that he ate too many lampreys, it's that he ate lampreys at all. The surfeit of lampreys idea comes from the hilarious book of maybe 80 years ago, 1066 and all that.
And another question from Rosario Bastos. This question is regarding to food and religion, let's say. So, through all Europe during Middle Ages, in certain periods that people obviously eat certain types of food because of their religion, there was any adaptation in terms of what that people eat in the various classes they are in, or it was the same for all of them when is related to religion?
Yes. So in Christianity, Catholic Christianity is practiced in the Middle Ages. There were at least 90 and perhaps as many as double that days when you had to abstain from meat. So that meant a tremendous amount of fish is consumed. Lamprey and some other things are considered fish, like whale meat. The wealthy, as I said before, had more options, more choice available. And you really see this with regard to fish. During Lent, which is a 40-day fasting period, the majority of people in Northern Europe certainly consumed herring, salted herring. In Mediterranean Europe, it might be sardines, sometimes salted cod, and fresh fish if they could get it. But generally speaking, and they're so bored with herring, they're going out of their mind because it's herring every day. Whereas the rich would have, there's one of the coronation banquets for Richard III of England took place on a fasting day, and there are 45 different fish dishes. So the religion affected very much the nature of the diet, and to some extent the class differences. Among Jews, you have various ways of celebrating the Sabbath as a special meal while not actually engaging in cooking with an active flame, which is a violation of the Sabbath. So a typical Spanish dish called aldafina. Aldafina is a kind of stew, very slowly cooked, and then with the coals banked so that it is served on Saturday at kind of warm temperature. This is very important, not so much for class reasons, but during religious persecutions of the Inquisition, not cooking on Saturday was suspect. So neighbors might say, I've never seen smoke coming out of their chimney on a Saturday. Or servants would say, they make this dish that they put in the oven and keep. I'm not saying anything, but I just thought you ought to know.
In terms of water and beer or wine, the big question. So most of people saying that during Middle Ages, or what we see in movies and stuff like that, is people could not drink water at all because it's contaminating. Is that true everywhere?
No. Thank you for mentioning that, because that's certainly maybe number 2 or 3 among false ideas having to do with food and drink. They're throwing stuff into the rivers, and they're dangerous. But first of all, people have wells, and there are springs. Unfortunately, a look at the less prosperous parts of the world today will convince you that it is popular to survive on contaminated water, even if it's not a way of flourishing. Monasteries had the more austere sorts had water. People went to some trouble to assure a difference between the places where they did leather tanning or other things that polluted water and where they actually drew their water from. Before climate change, much of Northern Europe was extremely wet. So the last problem they had was getting adequate water. And the Mediterranean regions were fairly ingenious about channeling water and about using the water that the rain that fell in the irrigation systems in Valencia, for example.
It's good that you touch the subject of climate changes as well, because mostly in medieval ages, obviously we start way before, but with agriculture and with the first time that men start touching the nature in a sense. Do you think it's from them or from this period that we can actually associate it with the first climate change that starts to occur in the stuff? Because obviously food, because agriculture happens because people need to eat. And
Yeah.
Can we say that? So,
yeah, this is not an area of expertise of mine, in part because there have been a lot of strides made in recent years because of better scientific ways of measuring the climate of the past. It changes a lot. This has become polemical in certain circles where the kinds of people who want to deny that climate change is now happening because of human intervention will point to, yeah, well, what about the little ice age in the 14th century or whatever? There's, there's no question that this has come on in a much more extreme fashion and much more quickly than any natural shifts. But yes, certainly you can see that at various times there are fluctuations in the temperature that make harvests better, crop yields better, that make it possible to grow things further north than would be the case later, that make Iceland and even Greenland easier to have pastures and some kind of cultivation. And then recently, more attention has been given to, if not climate change, at least sort of environment change brought about by humans, by terracing, by damming, channeling, cutting down forests. These do create different kinds of meteorological conditions over time.
And during Middle Ages, for example, if we look at Europe, could we say that it's massively different, the way that we ate, for example, in Portugal and, for example, in England, or, for example, in Portugal or in France? There was major differences, or overall, it was almost all this, not the same, because obviously the problems vary, but can we say that it's slightly the same way, at least, that they've ate in different countries of Europe?
I would say that it is very similar in that ordinary people from one part of Europe to the other subsisted on some kind of starch and some kind of alcohol. So some kind of bread, if possible, or porridge. And the choice has to do with some grains like wheat, obviously have gluten and can be made into bread easily. Others, like barley, only with difficulty, so that they're usually consumed as flat cakes or as in some kind of porridge. So this, it might be beer. It would be beer in the north or wine in the south. But the big difference would be the grains. So this is partly class. So a peasant might grow wheat, but only as a crop to be consumed by the lords. The peasants themselves might consume millet or barley or rye or spelt. And different parts of Europe have different basic staple grains, usually based on climate. Cold and degree of quantity of rain usually affect that. At the high end, the food was more varied generally, but in a way, you'd get the same kind of food at the court of the rulers of Portugal as you would at the court of, the Archbishop of Krakow, because as is the case with global food 100 years ago, had to be French. So, I mean, I've seen menus from what's now Jakarta, Indonesia, then the city of Batavia in the Dutch East Indies, from the fancy hotel, and it's French food. It's the menu's in French. There's absolutely no concession to local produce. You know, it's riz de veau à la française, and sweetbreads, or you know, lamb chops, or a leg of mutton, so forth. So you get the same phenomenon, that is, they're trying to imitate the fashions from one European court to the other. So in a way, the uniformity might be greater among the rich, even though they have more choice. But you know, if you're going to be entertaining on a grand scale and it's a fast day, you have to serve lamprey or else sturgeon, or you know, there's sort of a limited dossier of dishes that will assure your guests that you give them due consideration.
I know that you have a question as well.
Absolutely. One thing that I'd be interested to perhaps touch on is one of the points that you mentioned right at the start of this discussion about how some dietary customs amongst sort of the higher circles of society were designed to ridicule the customs of the poor. I'd be very interested to learn more about this, as it's something which I haven't quite come across yet in my studies. So would you care to please elaborate a bit more on that?
There's this is how I got started on the subject. I did a book called Images of the Medieval Peasant that was published around 2000. And I was interested in all sorts of upper class stereotypes about peasants, because while on the one hand, they're reminiscent of all sorts of racial, ethnic, and other unpleasant images of people who the writers consider themselves superior to, there's a fair amount on food, making fun of peasants for the disgusting food that they eat. And there's some disagreement among these upper class satires about whether the peasants like this lowly food because they're basically lowly, or you know, animal-like, or whether if they had their way, they'd be eating the food of their social superiors. So, for example, in a fabliau, you know, a French comic story, a peasant is driving a cart of manure through Montpellier, and he takes a wrong turn and gets stuck in the gets lost in the spice market. Montpellier had a famous spice market, and the unfamiliar odor of spices, which are too elegant for him, causes him to faint, and he falls off his cart. And you know, he's blocking traffic and creating an incident. But the only way to revive him, finally, is to take some of the manure off the cart and shove it under his nose, and that revives him because that's the smell that he's used to. Or in another comic story, a well-off peasant marries the daughter of some townspeople. So she's preparing the food for him that she grew up with, which is, you know, moderately nice, elegant food. And he suffers terribly from indigestion. He can't eat any of this food without ill effect. And so she gives him, you know, peas cooked in milk, or white beans, and he's happy because he's a peasant, and that's what he knows how to eat. So these satires, these images of what the lower classes eat. This is also found very much in the United States. I mean, it's found everywhere, but I'm familiar with it in the United States. White ideas of what Black people eat, racist stereotypes, but also urban ideas of what country people eat. When I lived in Tennessee, friends from where I'd grown up in the North assumed I must be eating squirrel, possum, I mean, they didn't really, but they would make fun of, well, I hope you're eating well in Tennessee and not having to eat too much raccoon, or these other hillbilly or rural dishes.
Professor, I have another question from someone who is watching, which is again Sariwash. She asks about the role of the cooking books. So they really used them, or it was more of a way of ostentation for the king's library, let's say?
There are about maybe 160, 170 cookbooks from the Middle Ages that survive, which is either a whole lot, given that almost no cookbooks survived from the Roman Empire. And why preserve cookbooks as opposed to hagiography or law? On the other hand, compared to works of medicine, hagiography, that's not a whole lot of manuscripts. They are not necessarily collector's items. In other words, they're not, with some exceptions, books that were for serious libraries of the monasteries, cathedrals, or rulers. But they're also not for home cooks until the very end of the Middle Ages. They're not addressed to, I'm the famous chef for the King of France, and here are some tips for you, ladies at home, in the manner of a 19th century or early 20th century chef writing a cookbook. They seem to be often for chefs to show other chefs what they are doing at their court. So there's an extraordinary because of the lavishness of the dishes, from a man known as Master Chicart, the chef for the Dukes of Savoy and Chambéry in the early 15th century. And, he has advice and he has instructions, but it's more the way you might have among experts, this is how I do this. So they don't fill in a lot of the blanks. Medieval cookbooks usually don't have quantities and don't have very detailed instructions. You do start to have this towards the end of the Middle Ages with some cookbooks written by women, by affluent but not noble women in German cities. And there's a famous Parisian one by called the Ménagier de Paris, by upper bourgeois man with a very young wife who claims that he's writing this book, which has stories and instructions and all sorts of household advice, but also 400 recipes, that he's writing this for his very young wife who doesn't know how to cook.
Can we say, if we obviously put the spices aside, because we know that they were extremely expensive during the Middle Ages, but what sort of food would you say it's the most expensive one if we put obviously spices aside?
The most expensive food would be fresh fish and game. Game tends not to be something that's sold, but requires resources to get. Among game, surprisingly, not a whole lot of deer. The most prized game are things like very small birds, like ortolans or larks, or very large birds. Peacocks are not game; they were raised domestically, but they're very expensive. Beef is not as expensive as it would later be. So, there's not a whole lot of prestige attached to that.
And shifting a little bit, can we say that foods, in a sense, can reflect the culture and the values of a society since ancient times?
Very much so. They also reflect the desire for exotica and going beyond the limitations of ordinary people. So one of the peculiar things about prestigious food now is the vogue for seasonality and locavore dining. The whole point of being rich up until about 20, 30 years ago was getting foods that were out of season, that came from far away, that required a lot of effort to obtain. So, all chickens were free range in Renaissance Florence. All fish, there were no fish farms. There were no, air cargo flights bringing bananas. Where I live, for example, you can get asparagus all year round from Mexico or Peru, but the short asparagus season locally, the asparagus is twice as expensive. That would not be the case in the Middle Ages, obviously. Everybody was a locavore, faute de mieux, except for the very wealthy who could actually go to great lengths to acquire ocean fish, even though they lived in Paris. Dried fruit from Spain, or lamprey from the Italian lakes where it used to be caught and considered to be among the best examples.
Peter, do you have a question as well, right?
Yeah, so I think just following on from that, I suppose sort of asking this as somebody with a background in the Islamic world, I appreciate that the main sort of import from outside of Europe would have been spices along sort of the Silk Roads and various maritime routes. But is there any evidence to suggest that any other sort of foods or dining trends were brought in from outside of Europe, or sort of became fashionable and then became imported by people who had the means to do so?
So things from outside of Europe, but not the Islamic world?
Things from outside of Europe, but not necessarily things like spices.
Well, dried fruit, for example, citrus fruit, which is not known, except in Spain until towards the end of the Middle Ages. Rosewater, sort of, that's not spices exactly, but aromatic effects, a food that is sort of perfumed. Musk and ambergris even used in food is an imported taste, very much. Some of these things ultimately come from India or from the non-Islamic East, but they are transmitted into Europe generally by intermediaries from the Islamic world. I mean, those intermediaries may be Muslim, but they also may be Jewish or Christian. But the transmission points are places like Alexandria or Beirut or the Black Sea or Constantinople. There are some tastes that come from Africa, although there's a spice called grains of paradise that was thought to come from India, like other spices, wherever India was, but from East in Asia, but actually was grown along the coasts of what are now Liberia and Sierra Leone. And it's a peppery reddish spice. It actually isn't related to pepper. It's also known as Malagueta pepper, and was very popular, particularly in Portugal, because the Portuguese were the first to trade with and exploit that area.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
But it's an example of something that was very fashionable in the Middle Ages and utterly forgotten. I believe Malagueta pepper is used in Brazil still a lot, but unknown in Portugal, as far as I know.
Yeah.
And Portuguese cuisine, has many effects, but spices are not among them.
True. I can say that. Our time is obviously reaching the end, and I don't want to keep the professor here for longer than we agreed. But I have probably one final question, because during our conversation, our lovely conversation, I've just realized that we cross some subjects like environments. We spoke about, obviously related to food. We spoke a little bit about the biology. We spoke a little bit about society. So can we say that probably food should be looked at something multi-level on our history, not just in one way of just suppressing a human need of eating, but in matter of fact having multi-levels that the food condition in the society. And to add on that, do you think that probably a multidisciplinary work and approach to food in Middle Ages would be a good idea?
Certainly, I believe that food tells us a lot about culture and society. The book that Peter mentioned, which will be published in October, called Why Food Matters, deals partly with the non-biological importance of food. I mean, obviously food matters because you can't survive without it. But beyond that, what does food tell us about people and cultures? And until recently, for reasons that are fairly arbitrary, food was thought to be unimportant and of culturally no significance. Whereas art or music did tell you about a culture. A chef very famous in the United States, originally from France, named Jacques Pepin, was chef to the president of France as a 20-year-old, and he came to the United States with tremendous experience in rather old-fashioned haute cuisine, and he enrolled in Columbia University, and he got his bachelor's degree, and then wanted to go on to graduate school in French literature. And he told his advisor that he wanted to do something on food in French literature, and he was told by this professor, this is in the 1960s, Monsieur Pepin, that is not a serious topic. Find another. So on the one hand, today, food in the Middle Ages, or food in any culture, as a historical or interdisciplinary topic, is fashionable. People in academia know that there is an intellectual way of looking at food, but they still don't really think it's important. If I were a junior faculty member and I decided I was going to write about food, I'd make sure that that was viewed favorably. Or to put it another way, when I retire, medieval history will still exist at my university. Things have not gotten so bad that they're going to just let that die. But there is absolutely no sense among my colleagues that they'll need to hire somebody who is a historian of food. It's not just that they reject the idea, but I know that it's not even on their radar screen. This is fine, but it's not a topic of vital importance. So a lot of studies, sort of begin by either lamenting the fact that this isn't regarded with the respect that it deserves, or celebrating the fact that it's regarded with much more respect than it used to have. But at the moment, it has this funny, and this is important for young scholars, it has this funny binary aspect of trendy but marginal at the same time.
And do you think a multidisciplinary approach, like, for example, using other colleagues from other sciences, like, for example, zooarchaeology, biology, do you think it will be important to probably have this multidisciplinary view of food?
Definitely. Whether that will be formal or not it's hard to create an interdisciplinary program in food studies. The leading one in the United States is NYU, New York University, Boston University has one as well. At various times, there have been informal groups without setting up an institute. I think Europe is better structured for that because it has teamwork much more than the Anglo-American system. And so, you know, the University of Tours, for example, has this and, you know, gets funding for ambitious studies that the European Union sponsors. And, you know, I mean, it's bureaucratic and it requires a lot of grant writing. But I think that's the area where you're going to find the sort of, unfortunately, post-Brexit, Britain and the United States are organized along a more artisanal, individualistic research line, which is good in the sense that it gives you freedom as an academic, and you're not part of a laboratoire, you know, of a kind of institute. On the other hand, particularly when you need scientific research like zooarchaeology, that's hard to do on an artisanal basis. You know, it requires equipment and teamwork.
Professor, I have just one more question from the people who is watching us, if you agree to answer as a last question. It's from Sergio, and he says, in medieval times, different dietary patterns of different peoples, for example, Romans, barbarians, Muslims, Christians, intersected. Were their foreign eating habits rejected for non-religion reasons? And can you give some examples?
The contempt of much, certainly Mediterranean Europe and of France for beer drinking. So, you know, here's an example of something where environment is not everything. Classes of Britain drink more beer, whereas the wealthy classes of the Mediterranean did not go to any lengths to import beer. They drank wine also. So, you know, there's just a kind of fixed prestige between these two different beverages, and travelers or just, you know, folk tales of the wine drinking countries regard. But you also have national stereotypes that the Germans are drunkards, that or Northern European descriptions of the Mediterranean. There's no meat. You know, I missed the roast meat of my homeland. They have all these. I mean, they don't use terms like tapas, but, you know, all of these funny little dishes and not big haunches of meat the way I'm used to. So yeah, there's a fair amount of non-religious ridicule and contempt for the food of other people.
Professor Freedman, thank you so much. It was a pleasure once again. It's to be a regular.
The pleasure was all mine, and thank you, Peter and Zhao, for inviting me and for organizing this.
No, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who is watching us. And until the next Confabulating, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.